After Effects includes certain effects that you could almost say are in the too good to be true category. These are the effects that create something from nothing. So content-aware fill will let you remove an item from your scene and fill it in. And the effect that we're going to look at today, WarpStabilizer VFX, will fill in motion to replace the original camera motion. So if the camera was too shaky, this effect will smooth out that camera motion, or if the camera was handheld and shaking and intended to be a lock off, you can actually lock off a shot. The VFX version of WarpStabilizer, which is the one included in After Effects, and I say that in opposition to the one in Premiere Pro, has a few extra advanced capabilities that we're also going to take a look at. The footage that we've been using on this course is all professionally shot, which means when there are pans or handheld camera moves, they are stabilized. They are using a tripod or a dolly or perhaps a Steadicam. And you really notice the difference when you compare that with, say, behind the scenes footage that is shot handheld. And in fact, nowadays, your phone camera may do a better job auto-stabilizing the shot than a more fancy, say, DSLR camera used to take the behind the scenes. So this is an example of a shot that is pretty cool, but is also a little distracting for how wobbly it gets, particularly there when we get onto the talent. Well, there's a tool to just take care of this, and it's one we haven't really touched on yet. And you probably know about it. It exists in Premiere as well. I'm just going to go ahead and right-click on that video layer, and under Track and Stabilize, choose WarpStabilizer VFX. It has VFX in the title, which would make you think it's a go-to VFX tool. In my experience, that's not exactly the case, but I think, if I remember correctly, they wanted to distinguish this version from the one that's in Premiere Pro, which is, I believe, not called WarpStabilizer VFX and doesn't have some of the abilities that I'm going to show you with this one. At the basic level, here's what it does. So you might have noticed the frame got a little bit scaled up and cropped. I'll talk about that in a moment, but let's just preview what we've got now. Well, we can all breathe a sigh of relief because we now have a nice smooth pan just like that. So this is kind of an ideal case of where you would probably want to go ahead and just apply this footage. This is not with the visual effects intention, it's just to make it more usable. And this effect is often really good for just this with these pickup type of shots. So I would hope that when you're shooting intentionally and deliberately, you're stabilizing your shots, but you can't always do it. Now let's just look a little bit at where this breaks and how you shoot to succeed with it. Oh, and let's talk first about what it's actually doing. So there are two different options in terms of the result. There's smooth motion, which is the default, and then there's no motion, which if I apply it here, will probably give me an error and a very strange result. Yeah, there's the error. So that's a lock-off shot, which it's just really not able to do because very little of this shot appears at the top and tail. If you don't understand what I'm talking about yet, we'll get to more stabilization that results in a lock-off, or what they call no motion. Going to the next category, the default is called Subspace Warp, which is some bizarre Star Trek-based name for pixel analysis along the lines of what, say, the time warp effect does, where it's creating image data that wasn't there. The other options for just stabilizing position, scale and rotation, or adding in perspective are more the kind of thing you could already do with, say, Mocha. So Subspace Warp is just adding this extra ability to, for example, in this case, deal with the camera optics. So if I drop this down to position, scale, and rotation, it's still going to have some success, but it's not quite as natural looking in terms of the lens distortion, essentially. So it just looks a little bit more like a shot that's been manipulated. That's often a fine choice, subspace warp, if it's not causing artifacts. Now notice, with that result, we have a more cropped in shot. And one thing I don't like right now is how their heads are cut off as we reveal them. So is there anything I can do about that? Well, the border category, this third drop down, is going to give me some control over that. And right now auto scale is on. So what happens if I just turn that off? It's still going to crop. And why is it cropping? Well, let me preview some more and talk about that. So it needs extra data. Actually, let me not crop and talk about it. If we just stabilize it, what you see is a gutter open up around the edges. This is just where it has no image data. And so it can't make up pixels that weren't there after stabilizing. Well, except that it can. So the final choice in this category is synthesize edges. Now this is going to be slower, but if I preview this one, in the beginning, it's pretty well able to come up with edge data based on adjacent frames, but you see some holes starting to open up where there are areas of the set coming into the frame and there's no adjacent frame that has that image data. So even though to our naked eye we kind of know that should kind of be the same thing, After Effects doesn't know that. So it's going to leave some holes, but we have a little bit less cropping around their heads. Let me go back though. Let's just say that that did not succeed, because it didn't. And let's just take a closer look here. There is a property that reads auto scale 107.0%. So that's the amount that it is scaling them up, 107%. And you can set a maximum and you can set additional scaling, but you can also influence the amount of scaling by changing the amount of smoothness. So if I lower the smoothness here to 20, the auto scale goes down to 104.2. So let's now preview that. The shot is not as stabilized, but it's still better than what we started with. Here I can forgive that this is more like a regular handheld shot rather than, say, a Steadicam shot now, but it's not as distracting. So that may be the thing that you are most likely to adjust in order to loosen up the frame a little bit and also just loosen up the amount of stabilization. Let's look at another example. So this shot of a car being driven onto set also exhibits some of the same issues. It just gets distracting, and you know, you get distracted by the fact that this is a camera person walking around with a camera. I already tracked this one, or rather, I didn't do anything. I just ran WarpStabilizer on it, and there it is. And this time the auto scale is kind of heavy. It's 125.6%. And let's take a look at the result. It's nice and buttery smooth, and then things get a little weird. As it starts to get bouncier in the original camera, you see some artifacting. Let me focus in on that a little bit. The warping is doing something odd with the side of the car. That's one kind of issue here. See that? That's just a little odd. It looks like the car's rocking in a way that it wasn't. But more than that, there's this motion blur that gets going in here, and it kind of blows the gag. For a stronger version of that problem, let's look at this shot. So here we have what probably should have been a lock-off. The camera operator is just standing in the parking lot, and just couldn't quite keep it steady. So here we got quite a bit of motion blur. So this time I've set the effect to no motion because that is really what I want, is a lock off. Let's turn it on and preview it. And it is locking it off pretty well there at the beginning, but things are unstable and then they get really unstable. So look at the hood of the car. At the beginning, it's not holding that well, and then it just goes to crazy town. So if you just want that first part of the shot, I think you could probably get away with just that, where she looks over right up to about there. Not too distracting, and then it becomes unusable. Now, if you ever find yourself shooting in order to stabilize, you can choose a faster shutter speed to reduce the amount of motion blur, but the main thing is you just want to try your best to not be so shaky with the camera if you think it's an important shot that you're going to want to use later on. I know that sounds obvious, but for those of you shooting your own elements or grabbing stuff on the fly or making a documentary or just going run and gun in certain situations, that's the thing to keep in the back of your mind. Now here is a more VFX application of the effect, and I'm going to show you the result first. What I have twirled down here is the advanced section of the effect, which we'll get into a little bit, but let's take a look at what we've got. So if you remember, tracking the screenless logo onto the back wall was a multi-step process, and here I've done it with no decisions on my part at all except where to position that logo. So I have a layer with the logo positioned, and it's just static, and I pre-comped it so that it would be the size of the frame, and I'm going to turn that layer off because what the effect is doing is using this apply motion to target over original. So I've set the target in this menu here, and then it is comping it over, and it doesn't give me anything fancy like a choice of blending mode. So I already set the opacity at a lower level in this pre-comp, but all I had to do was make those menu selections, and I have a tracked in logo in this case. Now obviously this wasn't a high degree of difficulty track to begin with, although one could potentially struggle with it, and I did see some students struggle with this in the work because there's nothing right there. It's a blank wall to track, and some of the other things you could track aren't coplanar, etc. So this is a way that you can automatically track that in. Notice that it has chosen no motion as the result, and so let me just do this one from scratch to show you that that wasn't actually my own decision. So to begin, we're going to do a normal smooth motion type of operation here, and it's not going to have a dramatic effect on the framing or anything because the amount of motion in the shot, which we were just looking at, is not that heavy. So even though it said it was set to no motion, it wasn't actually changing the motion at all. I don't know why it set the result to no motion. I will show you what that looks like as soon as this thing is done analyzing, hopefully in another second or two. And by the way, you can go work on a different comp while that works, just like the camera tracker. Okay, so that's done. I'll just scrub through here, and this is the smooth motion, and the camera is just now barely moving. The amount of auto scale is almost none. It's 100.9% now, so it's less than 1% scale up. If I go to no motion, the amount of scaling up now goes to 101.8%, but now we have a lock-off shot. But that's a heck of a boring shot, so that's why nobody uses that. So I'm going to undo, back to smooth motion, and now as my objective, switch to apply motion to target over original, There's also an apply to target, and these other two options I will show you in a moment. And it's going to shout at me in red to choose a layer. So it's chosen. And yeah, that's where it now changed it to a no motion result for reasons of its own. It is neither smoothing nor locking off the shot. It's just keeping the original motion and matching the other layer. Here's another handheld shot, and I'm going to go ahead and apply WarpStabilizer to it, but I have another goal in mind this time. So this time around, I have a logo, which I just made with some text, and it's 3D only because I wanted it angled to match the door, the angle of the door on the side of the car. And so back over here, I'm letting it analyze as usual, and as soon as it's done, we're going to have a stabilized shot. So this is just the default. And it has zoomed in quite a bit and gotten rid of some of the camera motion, which is not what I want. So instead, I'm going to go to Advanced and change the objective from Stabilize to Reversible Stabilization. Reversible. So now the reversible stabilization has effectively locked off the shot, but in a really weird way. Like in a way that it's hard to say why you would ever want this. If I turn on the logo, because I had already practiced and gotten it into place, it's right about where I want it, right on the door. And you can see where things get a little wobbly at the start and end, but it's basically sticking right there. But what's the point of that? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut, or actually I'll copy the effect and turn it off just so I still have it in case I need it, and paste it to that text layer above. And now it seems dreadfully wrong. One last step I need to take is to change from reversible stabilization for my objective to reverse. And now I have a logo that's stuck right to the door of the car. Pretty amazing, right? Why wouldn't you just do this every day of your life? Well, a couple reasons. One, if we critique this a little bit, you can see some slipping. Let me zoom in. So where it was getting all warpy, you can see the logo's kind of floating in there. Likewise, if I go to the end, things get a little slippy right in here as well. And so depending on how exact you need this to be, that's kind of a problem since this is a black box and there's no real easy way to fix it. But on the other hand, it's pretty well tracked right in the middle here. The other thing is motion blur. There is none. And as far as I can tell, there's no easy way to do it. You're stuck with the methods that you use for any moving element that didn't have motion blur. There are third-party tools for that, but honestly, you have to kind of live with the fact, as far as I can tell, that you don't get motion blur for free. So I can turn it on for that logo layer, and it doesn't change anything. And there are no sort of extra settings for that. That's unfortunate. But on the other hand, you may find the perfect use for this. And as you saw, it's effectively a, 3-4 step process. So WarpStabilizer VFX, you may never use it, or you may use it a lot if you end up with footage that was not shot properly. You might also use it in a visual effects context, although there are other ways to do things like stabilization and reversal. And we're actually going to get into those later in the course. That's a little foreshadowing.